All right, hello everybody, and welcome to a review of the second book in this Aliens Omnibus Volume 1. This one's called Nightmare Asylum. It is Steve Perry, not the musician, returning for his second book in the Alien series. If you remember the last one, Earth Hive, came out in 1992, right before Alien 3, the movie. So this book, Nightmare Asylum, was first published in 1993, and it completely goes off the rails as far as the movie timeline and is a completely separate story. So, there's going to be references to things before Alien 3, but as far as this book is concerned, Alien 3 itself, I think, is not canon? Question mark? Question mark. So the last book, Earth Hive, if you couldn't guess from the title, ends up kind of showing the ignominious end of Earth, right? It's taken over by the aliens through a series of, various plots. This book follows up on the one major thread of trying to win Earth back, or at least one major thread of someone trying to take Earth back, if that makes more sense. This book is a lot more linear than the previous book. The previous book jumped around a lot. You had this character's perspective, and then this group's perspective, and then this group's perspective. This one pretty much stays with the main characters, with some time spent getting into the mind of the villain, just to kind of develop and flesh him out a little bit. Another thing about this book is that it has a very clear 3-act structure. I don't usually try to, pigeonhole books into this, but this book has a very clear 3-act structure. And that has some upsides and some downsides, right? For instance, we have a more consistent, faster, kind of more relentless pace in this book, which means that it's easier to keep the pages turning, which is a good thing. We have a style which is straightforward, as it was in the previous book, but it also includes a little bit more of the kind of the alien universe jargon to it. So we get a little bit more of that, which is a nice touch, of course. The previous book, I complained a little bit about how the gun terminology was kind of misused in a few places, it seemed. This book does better with that as well. So, again, those complaints are not part of this book either. We get some cool details about, people moving in low gravity, or, different things like that. So, it's well-written, it's workmanlike. The prose isn't going to jump out and amaze you with its poetry, but at the same time, it's written well. The characters that get developed well. We have some returning characters from the previous book who get more development. We have the villain who gets some good development. The rest of the characters in the story kind of are a little bit flat. And of course, that's kind of like the slasher movie influence in the alien universe coming to the forefront, right? You don't need to know that much about the character who's going to die in 3 minutes kind of thing, right? So there's some of that. I think I mentioned that there was some literary references in the previous book, but in this one there's actually a Sherlock Holmes reference, which I thought I might just show you guys. For page 431 in this edition. The pilot looked puzzled. Spears said, "You don't know the story of the barking dog, do you, son?" The pilot shook his head. Back on Earth, long time ago, there was a famous investigator working on a crime. While listing the clues, he said, "And of course the matter of the dog barking in the night." His assistant, who had been compiling the evidence, said, "But the dog did not bark." "Precisely," the detective said. Fun little Sherlock Holmes reference. We have a quote from Aliens, page 509. Oh, yeah. So, a couple of the characters are getting out of cold sleep. Wilkes sat up, rubbed at his eyes, stuck his tongue out. He looked over at Billy and nodded. "Time to rise and shine," he said. His voice was a hoarse croak. "Another glorious day in the Corps." Billy stared at him. "That's what my old platoon sergeant used to say every time we finished a session in one of these suckers," Wilkes said. "What happened to him?" "Something he disagreed with ate him." So we got an Apone reference there, which is nice. And another thing that this book does is it develops that telepathy angle that kind of showed up in the previous book, but it does so more in amount, but less in nuance, if that makes sense. Last time we had elements of people are getting these telepathic messages, and the aliens are communicating with each other with these telepathic methods, and there's this going on, and there's this going on. In this one, there's more of it, in the sense that people are studying how the aliens communicate with each other, but there's not as much like, ooh, this is mysterious, or ooh, this is interesting, or ooh, what exactly is happening here, or ooh, what does this telepathic message manifest as in this person's dream, right? There was a lot of that in the previous book where it's like, I dreamt of this, and the reader is like, oh, well, this symbolizes this and this symbolizes this, but of course the people in the story don't know, or there was it was the occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. That was the literary reference in the last one. There was that, which was interesting, right? So we get more practical exploration of the telepathy or empathy problem between the aliens and humans in this book, but it's not as delicately handled, I would say. We get one more cool science fiction element in this book, and that is the effect of warp space or Einstein space on the human mind in this book. That's the 10-minute signal. We're going to warp, he said. Better get to the sleep chambers. What's the hurry? Warp space does ugly things to your mind if you stay awake. I did half an hour once, part of a test group. It makes your worst nightmares seem tame. She shuddered, and he knew how she felt. They had both dreamed about the aliens too many times, and those visions were horrible enough. So that's kind of a neat thing where, oh yeah, you can't stay awake. That's why we have these hypersleep chambers, is because you can't stay awake in warp space, because if you do, you go nuts. Kind of a... You can almost get a little bit of a, what do you call it, Event Horizon thing out of it, which, I don't know if that movie had come out yet at this point, but, it's a neat idea, and it's another little bit of the science fiction lore that helps to make this story and other alien stuff fun, so I thought it was nice. Unfortunately, this is an aliens book, and so it's not really the focus of the story to have these little science fiction ideas or futurism necessarily. It's all to a very practical thing of, let's have the aliens do cool stuff, and we do get a lot of that in this book. So, still I would say it's a solid story with, exciting set pieces. One of the things that I kind of mentioned in the previous book is that there was some, salacious content that was not especially necessary, or, could have been done in a less salacious way, I guess. This book, unfortunately, has even more of it. It has a similar amount of it. I don't know if even more is the right amount, but the problem is not that there's more of it, it's that it's more gratuitous. There's even less of in the previous book, when there was salacious content, it was there for a reason. Either to show the development of a relationship between two characters, or to show kind of the levels of depravity of this other particular character, right? It actually had an effect. In this book, it appears in three or four little places, and one of them is totally hilariously gratuitous. One of them is character development that could be handled in a better way, and there was another one that is similar. It was character development that could be handled in a better way without the I don't know, the baseness of it, I guess. It's just not very necessary, and it's not very well or tastefully done. Despite the minor downside to this story of it being a little bit more linear, of the characters being mostly flat, it still had a really good pace to it. And when I was reading it, I felt pretty tempted to read the whole thing in basically one sitting. It has a small, strong cast and a very relentless pace, and so you kind of keep wanting to turn that next page and see what the next chapter is going to give you. But once I finished reading it, I kind of cooled off on it a bit over the next couple of days, because number one, the effect of the pacing wore off. It's when you don't actually have the book open in front of you, there's no desire to turn the next page, and then you can start looking at the plot a little bit more, I guess, objectively. And some of the more cliche elements and the linearity of the story kind of stood out a bit better to me. It's a good book, but it's not as rereadable as the previous book. You'll enjoy reading it, but you won't want to reread it as much. So let's get to the spoiler section, and then we'll have a little conclusion, and we'll call it a review. All right, spoilers. So I said in the non-spoiler section, this book has a very 3-act structure. I'm going to explain those here. Act 1, stowaways on the ship. So in the previous book, they basically got surreptitiously onto an unmanned ship that was going somewhere, and they didn't know where, but they needed to get off Earth, right? This is Wilkes, Billy, and Mitch, right? So they don't know where they're going. They don't know when they'll arrive, and they're making the best of the situation. They're just kind of living out, living on this ship, and going into hypersleep when they need to, and waking up, and living when they can. There's some interpersonal stuff that goes on that I won't spoil too much of that because that's actually integral to the plot and the character development. But kind of this life of relative peace is shattered suddenly by the realization that there are aliens in the cargo. In fact, there were humans that were in the cargo that were in hypersleep, but apparently the cold sleep isn't even enough to stop the alien growth inside of a human, which puts a bunch of other alien plots kind of in the dumpster, doesn't it? Because half the time they're like, oh, we'll get an alien in you and we'll put you in hypersleep. In this story, they put the people in hypersleep, or I guess they kind of technically wiggle their way out of it by saying that they're not technically in hypersleep, but they're like 1 degree away from hypersleep. I don't know. It's very iffy to me. And so, it was like, fine, whatever. But anyway, the aliens pop out of these people, and the aliens are running around in the cargo hold until they get really hungry, and then they start, battering on the walls, basically, and cannibalizing each other. So now we get this very action-packed sequence of dealing with the aliens without destroying the ship. And there's a fairly good handling of, the dangers of the alien on the ship. Are they going to create a hull breach? Can we seal it off? Do we have the right bulkheads in the right places? Once we get them out of the ship, are they just going to fly off, or are they going to grab onto the outside of the ship and hang on? They have to deal with all these questions and all these problems one at a time, and, with a fairly decent time crunch on them for doing it. So, long story short, they manage to deal with the aliens, and then they find, hey, we're actually getting close to a planet, and it looks like there's a base on this planet, and that's where we're probably going to end up landing, because we don't have any control over the ship. And that takes us to Act 2, which, the story is called Nightmare Asylum, and so I'm going to call Act 2 Nightmare Base, because it's not really an asylum, because the crazies are in charge, and in an asylum, generally speaking, the crazies are not in charge. At least, you hope so. So they land on this distant marine outpost, and they discover that it wasn't an accident that there were infected humans 1 degree away from hypersleep on the ship. That was intentional. They were gathering information about the aliens to try to come up with a way to counter them, which, is a pretty standard idea, but, most of the aliens on Earth at this point are not aliens that came out of people. They're aliens that came out of, cows and bears and deer or whatever, right? So there's a bit of an issue there. Now, the commanding officer of this military base is named Spears, and his plan is to use the aliens against the aliens, to take back Earth by turning the aliens into a pro-human fighting force. Spoiler, as you probably could guess, he is nuts. He's very nuts. They don't make it like this long drawn-out thing. You discover fairly early on that he is crazy, and that, he's basically feeding his own men to these aliens as a disciplinary measure. It's bad. And so it is a nightmare, but it's not a nightmare asylum because the crazies are in charge. In fact, we do get some good views inside Spears' head, which actually, sympathetic is not quite the right word, but it does show you that his goal is to become the savior of Earth, albeit with really, really awful means, right? He's kind of a, ends justify the means kind of character. It's a little bit deeper than that, but you don't ever become sympathetic with him, but you at least kind of understand his motivation. And, he's kind of got this, what would you call it? He wants to be the ruler of the Marine Corps of the Marines at that point, and he's like, if I can save the Earth, then I'll be able to turn that into real authority, and if anybody goes against my authority, I'll just have the aliens eat them. So good times. One of the cool things about getting into Spears' head is that he gives a lot of references to real Earth military history, which are interesting and colorful and help to round out his character to show who he respects, who he kind of grudgingly respects, etc., etc. And of course, with Spears being nuts, as he is, this place that should have been a refuge turns into this fight to survive and escape again. We come back to Wilkes and Billy and Mitch, and they try to set up some kind of a mutiny to deal with Spears when Spears is vulnerable, and it doesn't actually work very well. One of the cool things about this act of the book is that we get lots of cool details about the alien life cycle and biology. We get to learn more about how the Queen telepathically controls the soldiers, and we get some fun details about the process of figuring out the mechanism by which the Queen controls them, right? They talk about tests that they did in the book where, like, oh yeah, we thought maybe it was like a pheromone thing, right? So what we did is we took an alien and we took him 40 miles away and put him in an all-metal box, and the Queen could still control him. So clearly there's some kind of thing going on that can go through the metal box and over long distances very quickly, so it's not a pheromone, stuff like that. So it's kind of well done. But anyway, this attempted mutiny by Wilkes and Billy and Mitch and some of the people on the base leads to this massive battle, which is handled decently, but not especially well. It's not the best written kind of conflict that I've ever seen. There are some cool parts where, like, oh, I had this special thing. I kind of planned for this, or I didn't plan for this, or oh, I had this contingency plan for this. There's some of that which is cool and fun, but the battle itself is a little too chaotic to make sense of, and so it doesn't really grip you that well. In the end, Wilkes and Billy just barely escape again onto another ship, which again is an unmanned ship, or supposed to be, and that leads us into our third act, which I don't have a good title for. I guess just Final Fights, something like that. The main chunk of the book is that second act. So Spears lifts off in one ship. He has another ship that's behind him that Wilkes and Billy are on that is basically full of aliens that are on ice, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense considering that the aliens developed while they were on ice in the first ship. But again, there's that 1 degree thing that I think Perry is trying to wiggle out of things with. So probably they're going to Earth. That's what they guess. But the question is, does Spears know that they're there? Are they going to go into warp, etc., etc., etc.? How are we going to deal with Spears if we can? Do we even have a chance? There's a lot of really cool plotting that goes on there that I think is fun and interesting. And then when the two ships start to decelerate, they jump across from their ship to Spears' ship in a kind of tense scene where not only are they in these space suits, but they also have to be very careful about communicating because they're being aware of sending like radio communications towards Spears' ship. So there's some fun stuff going on there. Once they arrive, we get some very good tense tactics and machinations, which are kind of fun to read. We get attack and defense, we get deception and bluffs and counter bluffs in a fairly compact package. So it's actually very, fun to read. And it ends up with kind of like a partial victory, right? Wilkes and Billy escape, but Spears escapes too. So, and Spears has his aliens with him as well. So it's kind of like a partial victory, but like we'll take what we can get kind of thing. Survival over total victory. And then the book reaches its final chunk, where Spears lands on Earth and tries to use his aliens against the other aliens. I'm not going to spoil how that goes. There's only a couple of ways that it could go, and you can probably make some guesses, but I'll leave it to someone who wants to read the book. And then we have an even more surprise ending, where Wilkes and Billy end up on, I think it's a lunar base. They're a little bit unclear, but they meet, but they end up on the lunar base, and the lunar base doesn't have any aliens on it, and there's someone there that is kind of interesting and was not what I was expecting, and I'll leave that unspoiled as well. So yeah, and we'll call that the spoiler section, and we'll move on to the conclusion. Okay, in conclusion, this book was more fun to read in the moment than Earth Hive. It has a more relentless pace. It has a more linear structure. You're not constantly jumping back and forth between 3 or 4 different characters' perceptions. And so it's easier to read, and it's easier to keep flipping that next page. There's fewer places where you're like, oh, I can stop here, because We just went from this person's perspective to this person's perspective, and we're going to be there for a few chapters, so I can just kind of duck out here and go grab lunch, right? There was less of that in this book. I've definitely felt like I could finish this whole book in one sitting. But at the same time, because of the plot being more linear, because of the smaller number of well-developed characters, because of the kind of more obvious 3-act arc of the story, it has less reread appeal. I'll admit that, right? It's a fun book to read once, and even some parts of it are fun to read over and over again, or at least over again, right? I haven't read any part of it more than twice at this point, but I guess my point is that there's some fun action. There's some action that doesn't work very well in the middle, but there is some cool character development of the few good characters that there are. The pace is engaging. It keeps you turning the pages. And, as opposed to the previous book, which was kind of mystical and philosophical, we get much more practical in this book. So, the previous book was about how can we... it had a cult subplot, and it had, a satellite hacker, and it had a government group, and it had the company group following the government. It had all this stuff going on. And this book is really, really simple as far as the plot goes. And then the tension itself in the book is more kind of direct tension from real danger, as opposed to kind of like the creeping mystery tension that was prevalent in the previous book. So, it's one of those things that is fun in the moment, but the more you look back at it, the less satisfying it feels, if that makes sense. But the ending of this book flows into the next book, which is called The Female War, and that book is written by Steve Perry and Stefani Perry. Now, in the previous review for Earth Hive, I did the most minimal bit of research into this, and I couldn't find any direct reference to the relationship between Steve Perry and Stefani Perry. But then what I did was I read the dedications to the start of the third book, and I was like, oh, this sounds like ... And I went and kind of looked a little bit more targetedly, and it turns out that Stefani Perry is actually the daughter of Steve Perry. So Steve Perry was born in the 50s or something like that, and Stefani Perry is born in the 70s, 80s, something like that. I don't know, something. Anyway, they're father and daughter, not like two people who are unrelated, as I suggested in the previous review. Because anyway, it was one of those things where if you just look up authors on Wikipedia, it doesn't say, oh, by the way, her father is this other author who does novelizations. It's just like, but again, the name similarities were so significant that I was like, they have to be related in some way, but I couldn't find any concrete evidence for the previous review, but now I finally did. So anyway, I'll probably take a look at The Female War in a couple of weeks or something like that. But I don't feel like again, the first book was really cool and it had a lot of really neat stuff going on. And that pushed me into reading the second book. But the second book, after I finished reading it, I was like, oh, that's actually a lot simpler of a story than the first book. So I don't feel like super heavy motivated to get into the third book immediately. I'm sure I will at some point, because I do want to see how it all finishes out. But I'll probably do something else next week. I haven't done a pulp reading in a while, so maybe I'll do something like that if I can find something that would be fun to read. Anyway, that's all I've got for this week. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.